Okay, I think it's about time to get started. Welcome everybody. I'm Cliff Lynch, the Director of CNI, and you have found your way to one of the project briefing sessions in the Spring 2020 CNI virtual member meeting. This meeting will run through the end of May, so we're a little more than halfway through. And today we have, I think, a particularly timely session. Certainly the events of the last couple of months have really, I think, emphasized the need to think hard about how we're managing our print collections collectively and institutionally. And I think have also underscored the importance of redoubling our efforts to get many of those collections into digital form. Fenella France from the Library of Congress is going to tell us about a Mellon-funded project which I think will help us to make some of these choices in a wiser and more data-driven way, and she will share the specifics of that with you. Fenella will give a presentation, and then Diane Goldenberg-Hart from CNI will pop up to moderate questions and discussion at the end. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and I'd invite you to use that to enter questions during the presentation at any point so that we have those ready when it comes time to do Q&A at the end. So with that, I'll just welcome everybody and thank you for joining us. And I want to say a special thanks to Fenella for offering this virtual project briefing to help inform our members. Thank you again, and over to you, Fenella.
Thank you, Cliff. And I just really want to take this time to take a huge thank you to Cliff and Diane and Beth, who have just been phenomenal with organizing this and made it so easy. I'm going to blank out my screen of me so that you can just focus on the screen, and hopefully that will reduce any technical problems. But I know that if there's any issues, they will pop up and let me know. So really wanted to sort of dive into this. This goes back a few years and really focuses on the challenges we have with how we make informed decisions and how we think about our print collections, and how can we get that information that helps you make that valid decision rather than just hoping you've made the right one. So how can we effectively address the physicality issues of our print collections? What sort of data do we need to make that decision? And then to really advance our presence in the digital realm, what can be digitized? And then, depending on the condition, how effectively are we making that decision to prioritize digitizing the at-risk collections first? And until we know about the physicality of those materials at risk, it's challenging for people to make that decision. So I'm really delighted to be able to share this research project. We're funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation beginning last January, and this is for just over 3 years to take the same 500 volumes using a stratified random representative sample, and I can go into that in depth later if people are interested, from 6 different research libraries. One of those, the Library of Congress, has agreed to include theirs in the program. And from the time period 1840 to 1940. So we're really looking at the time period of mass production, where we're starting to see some of those challenges in terms of the pulp and more acidic papers, but also trying to understand more about what is that physicality, rather than us visually looking at it. And my assessment, depending on how I might think about its condition, could be very different to yours, but that could have a profound impact on which volumes we're actually collecting and preserving effectively. So we have 5 research partners: Cornell, University of Miami, University of Washington, Arizona State, and University of Colorado at Boulder. And huge kudos, they have just been phenomenal to work with, just really supportive from early days when we were desperately looking for funding through to now, when we're telling them to hold sending shipments because we can't, we're not allowed in the building and we can't take any shipments in or out. And I wanted to give you the link here to our public-facing website, nationalbookcollection.org, and you will get you can access this later, and I'm happy to send it more information. But this gives us sort of a bit more in-depth details on what I'll be going through in this presentation. So in terms of the data analytics and the possible trends, what we're really trying to find out is which factors contribute most or have more of an influence on what the state of the condition of the text block of the book itself is. I'll just note that while we are looking at the condition of the binding, that is not the current focus of the intent of this research project. So we want to know more about the inherent properties of the paper, the impact of environment and usage, and partners are providing environmental and circulation data they have. Unfortunately, generally this often goes back only a few decades, and as many of you know, when collections get moved from one location to another, it's really hard to keep up with that. So the interesting thing is so far, and as you'll see as we go through, we seem to be finding that the inherent properties of the paper are having a much greater influence than we had expected. And I'll also point to the East Boston Consortium. They have some lovely data on their website, and I've talked a lot with Susan Stearns, and their data seems to suggest a 5% loss in condition from collection use, and this also ties in with another collaboration, collections demography, with the University College London. So what have we done? We have taken all of the catalogue information from OCLC, and we've been looking to see how accurate that is and isn't. And that's been particularly interesting in terms of thinking about whether we're looking at the same volume. Very often it's listed in the catalogue as the same date, but it's not actually quite the same date. So we've been capturing that data as well and sharing that back to our partners and using that to see how that relates to or shows a difference in terms of the volumes we're looking at, and whether in fact what people think is available on their shelves as well. From there, what we've been looking at first is going from what most people have available. What's your visual assessment of your collection? And usually people have sort of a fairly standard assessment form. And we reached out to partners and other colleagues to see how could we capture the most information that might be usable, that we could take from the visual assessment and then link it with the physical analyses that we are doing. And so what we're doing with this is taking a small sample from each page of a general collection book and using that about a 3/8 inch strip to correlate the objective scientific analyses with the visual assessment. I will note, look at the third bullet point, which is, do we know what is the same volume and what does identical mean? And this has been a very fascinating area for us as we've started working through this data. So we have a very interesting platform where we're pulling in all the information, cataloguing that. Every book has its own individual unique ID. We're capturing all of the catalogue details about that. Has it been rebound? What other information can we find about it? Looking at even the height, width, and thickness. We initially, in our first shipment, found comparing LC volumes with Arizona, 3 volumes that were supposed to be identical were completely different in size. 2 were the same. One was twice as thick. The edges hadn't been cut. Totally different paper, and yet the published date and location was exactly the same. And these are some of the interesting, and I will say delightful, rabbit holes we've been going down on, trying not to go down too far. And so as we start to look into the description, we have been describing the binding, and these were things that the partners thought would be really useful. Can we start to see differentiation in terms of the colour, whether there's obvious rebinding? There was a lot of interest in understanding whether this was the original binding and whether that could be useful as we describe the volume. And the binding notes, what else are we finding in terms of this that gives us other information that can be shared back with partners and can help us think about what might be useful parameters as we capture a catalogue information. And in terms of the text block, keeping this fairly high level, what are we seeing? Is it black ink? Is it coloured ink? Are there different types of paper in it? Are there multiple papers, tip-ins, other things like that? Then we've been moving on to the condition assessment and balancing from everything we're seeing, and this is just a capture from one specific volume, is this something that the library would lend? So sort of trying to capture the number of tick boxes and how that correlates back to the condition of the book just from a visual assessment. And this has been interesting as we've started to look at this, because we've found that we then wanted to separate this out from the condition of the text block into 4 fairly specific areas that seem to correlate a little bit more effectively with what we're seeing in terms of the objective scientific analyses. So the physical condition on the first column on the left, in terms of is it brittle or crumbling, in terms of damage and loss, are there loose pages? That's sort of a very visceral and initial response, and seems things that we thought would be correlating fairly closely with some of our objective measures. The structural in terms of the physical, we separated out as things that might be happening but may not necessarily be inherently connected to the physical quality of the paper, the text block itself. The visual was the area when we did a round robin of how many people were assigning the same values here, was the one that was most prone to being subjective in terms of colour, how people assessed the amount of fox and the amount of staining. And so we wanted to sort of group this together, because that was a bit of a challenge. What I will also note, and I didn't mention earlier, we have 2 researchers who are all doing the same exact tests. So we've reduced the number of inter-researcher challenges or potential errors, and each month we are giving them a volume that has been looked at previously to see how closely they are matching, and to be able to make sure that they aren't moving away from they haven't got a sort of a bias shift in terms of their analyses. And then the event traces is things that have externally happened but are not essentially inherent to the paper itself. So is there water damage? Are there insertions? Other things like that. And just wanted to show you an example. We've been taking a lot of documentation. This is an example where, in fact, there's a separation in terms of the spine, but the paper is in very good condition. So while it's a physical damage, it's not actually damaging the content of this book itself. So as part of, as we go through the rest of the data that we've been collecting on these volumes, we are doing a photo documentation of the front cover, the spine, the title page, and the title page verso, just to see and do a cross correlation again with what information is in the physical volume and how that relates to the catalogue. And as I don't have time in this presentation, but with the website, you can essentially pull up, we've almost got it up there on the public, you'll be able to pull up the same 5 volumes and look to see how similar or different they are in terms of visually and what you can see from condition there, which is a beautiful segue into what does identical look like. And I was really surprised to find that we had such a difference in the volumes themselves, in terms of their bindings and in terms of the papers. So I'm going to slowly skim through the next 5 slides from the 5 different research partners. They're the same book starting left to right, and you'll see as not all partners have exactly the same volumes, even though they thought they did, but you'll see very quickly that we have quite a difference in terms of the binding, the colors, of the surfaces. And this became a really interesting quick visual to see how similar or different these books were in terms of what we were actually seeing as we went through the different volumes. And that is brings up a really interesting question. We're not going to answer this question today, but it is one of those things that I think we all want to know. What is the best volume to keep if we can't keep every one? And are there annotations? Are there other features we should be considering as we go through that? Just one wonderful, interesting thing many of you will know about the Book Traces project. We had 2 interns over summer, last summer, and we asked them to take the period they were there to go through volumes and start to list how many pages were missing and also how many were annotated. And this was a very interesting example of a very personal dialogue between the person who donated these books and the actual what he thought of the author. And if I zoom into that, you know, it occurs to me that Logan is too hasty. He tells us that, you know, that we've only finished half of the volunteers engaged, and so it's a really interesting interaction between the reader, or in this case the donor, and the author. We also found, surprisingly, we found a number of annotations that were from Uncle so-and-so or Aunt so-and-so to someone and dated the 25th of December. So it seems to me books often at certain time periods, and most of what you're seeing in this presentation is 1840 to 1890, were last minute gifts to the nieces and nephews, which is an interesting little anecdote. What we didn't expect to find was multiple different types of paper in the same volume. And if I zoom in on that, this is one volume with 5 different types of paper. Why is that important? Well, if one of these is highly acidic, then it is going to be having an impact on the rest of the book, even if other parts are, you know, in good condition. And I think what's fascinating is that we're trying to be very rigorous about how we're assessing trends. We have started to see a potential correlation between this and popular fiction books, Stowe, Mark Twain. We're seeing some of those books do often and continuously have multiple types of paper in them. So moving on to the subjective tests that we have been doing in the visual tests. We're doing our beloved double fold, and I'll come back to that in a minute. We've been trying to look at spot tests to see if sizings and things like that might actually, you know, if we're seeing significant correlation between alum sizing and damage, is that something that people could use as a quick tool? The volatiles profile, what we affectionately call book sniffing, we actually can take the profile of the different types of degradation products we find, whether it's acetic acid, furfural, formic, things like that. And we've also correlated that to the Barrow collection, which is 1,000 books from 1500 to 1900. And we have essentially done a profile at every decade, which we can use to correlate with what we're seeing coming in from partners. So we're not sure whether that's going to really tell us a lot, but we sort of doing everything we can while we have these books to see if that may be a helpful thing with a simple sniffer in the collection to see if that would be useful. So what you can see here now is as we go into the data, the infrastructure, the database, is we are pulling those general condition points from the visual assessment, and we're starting to see how they might correlate to the other assessments that we're doing. So as you can see here, we've got some of the spot tests, which are often very challenging to determine. Is it light pink? Is it bright pink? Particularly when we have different colored papers. And this is something we're working to develop a more effective way. Can we use some sort of stain for different things that, regardless of the paper substrate, white or yellow background, will continue to give you the same response that you might be able to use more effectively. In terms of the miniaturized tests, the analytical tests, as I said, we're taking a tiny strip of paper. We're doing a mini tensile test to look at the strength, the mini pH to look at the acidity of the test, and a size exclusion chromatography, which is actually looking at the chain length of the cellulose in the paper, and that we're just taking a very tiny sample can actually help us get a much more accurate correlation of how strong is the paper. So when you turn the page, are you more likely to break it or not? A very quick visual entree into our labs. And with the pH, we are capturing that, as I said, from that tiny sample, and the tensile as well. With the tensile test, we're taking a 10mm strip from the edge of the paper, and we're doing it in 2 different orientations, and I'll come back to that in a wee bit. But you can see here that we actually can see how that, how much force does it take to break that paper, and how does that potentially correlate to how strong the paper is when someone is using the physical volume. The size exclusion chromatography, as you can see there, how strong are the actual sample, the fibers, as something ages, that long polymer gets shorter, and that contributes to the strength. What we are doing here is that tiny sample, that little yellow white dot, is about 1 millimeter. So we take 3 of those dots, and we can tell you how strong the paper is. The non-invasive, those were destructive tests. The non-invasive test methods that we were using are infrared spectroscopy, so we can look at the different chemical bonds in the structure and the sizing and different things, and start to correlate those with those destructive test methods. And that's something we're just delving into to see, can we actually use that as a non-physical and non-destructive means. And ultraviolet or visible spectroscopy, just shining some light to get the optical measure of that. What does that look like? So here's the infrared spectra. We can see how similar or different that is from the edge to the inset of the book, and whether we're seeing different peaks on that might relate, for example, to lignin or other parts of the paper that might be indicative of damage. And the reflectance spectroscopy, we can actually, with the database, we're pulling in all of the raw data, so we can look at the raw data, we can do different derivatives, and see how that's correlating. Which of those peaks, I know you're looking at this going, oh, what is she showing me? But it may be that we find one of those peaks is really important in us correlating the damage. So if we can do that non-invasively with just shining some light at the edge of a paper, can we start to potentially turn that into an app or some way of pulling out the information? Because we're getting color data from this, we can then also look at what's that shift in color objectively, rather than subjectively saying, I think it's a bit yellow, or I'm not sure. So sometimes you often see, you will have noticed that around the edge of the book, you are probably seeing some color shift, some color change. What is that shift, and is that something that we could use as a simple measure as well? And how do we know if the papers are the same or not, as we mentioned earlier? So what we have been doing is we have a large collection of reference papers that are completely characterized, and we have put all of those features into this database, this active database. We can now then, as I referred to, start to see what does that mean in terms of the infrared. So we can use the knowns and then start to put our unknowns into this statistical spreadsheet and mapping, and see what does that mean. So for example, this top left is all of our rag papers, our very nice, good quality rag papers. Down the bottom here, this relates to newsprint, so really generally pretty poor quality paper. In the middle, we have mixtures of different pulp papers, and so we can start to use this idea to see how we can understand more about what we're seeing in our collections. So one example here, when we did a quick check with this, you're seeing, so this is flipped from the previous one, but a lot of the collections we saw correlating very closely with rag paper, and we thought that's interesting. Then we looked at their catalogues, and they were all pre-1845. So this does seem to be an interesting way, and as we get more of our, and furthermore into our testing, we've only done 455 books so far, we'll get a better feel for what that actually means. What we really want to do is see how can we use, we know you all can't come into the lab with your books, so how can we use this huge collection of data to create really useful field evaluations or stat tests? So we've been starting to look at a simple bend test. Can we get a more effective pH pen that, regardless of the color of the paper, might potentially say to you, this will absolutely tell you it's pH 5 or less, so you might want to start to think about this collection being slightly at risk and put that forward in your digitization. what we have also done is we've created a quick query tool. So we can, rather than having to map everything at once, we can very quickly say, is there a correlation between the strength and the pH? And if we overlay the aluminum, what does that tell us? So a few graphs here, just as I wrap up. We're seeing, right now, we've only done all of the books from 1840 to 1890 for our 5 partners. And we're seeing a large collection clustered in the 4.5 to 5 range. So, you know, relatively acidic range, given that 7 is neutral. When we look at the length of the molecule, we're seeing, you know, again, a shift and a clumping, sort of with, you know, showing that there's some correlation there between the strength and that we, you know, it's not highly as strong as we might have hoped. This is a really interesting one I thought many of you might be intrigued about. So when we do our tensile testing, we are testing it both in the direction of the paper, lengthwise and across. We're doing 5 of each. And we have found that publishers did not always put the paper in the strongest, you know, the books are not always bound to make best use of the paper's machine direction. So we're seeing clustering here, those 2 clusters you're seeing are the vertical and the horizontal, and that can actually have a big impact on the strength of that book as people are turning the page. Can we see a correlation between the yellowness and the pH or the acidity? And we seem to be starting to see a correlation between that as well. Sadly, I hate to tell you, but we've been trying very hard to correlate double fold to any of our parameters. As you can see, we are not seeing clumping. We're seeing just all over the place in terms of what we're seeing with that. So if you go to this website, we have a list of the 500 books. I've had a number of people ask, could we share that list because they'd be interested, and we haven't put it up yet, but if people are interested, we'll be happy to share the assessment criteria that we are using, and if people want to actually look at some of their volumes to see how they relate, we'd be happy to add that data into what we've got as well. So just to conclude, this data we're hoping is really helping us to identify materials at risk and help you all to make more accurate decisions, and trying to use this knowledge to create more useful stack tools. That doesn't mean you need to take them to a lab, but you can use them intuitively, that they're quick, accurate, and easy to use. And with that, I will acknowledge all of my wonderful colleagues who have worked with me, and I will open it up for questions.
Thank you, Fenella. That was fascinating. Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. And thank you so much for coming to CNI to share it. And thank you to all of our attendees for joining us today for this webinar, which is part of CNI's Spring 2020 virtual meeting. We're really delighted that you could join us today. And I want to go ahead and invite you to type in your questions in the Q&A box. And Fenella will answer those live. And while we're waiting to let folks type their questions in, again, I just want to welcome you to CNI's 2020 virtual membership meeting, which is going on through the end of May. So we will have lots of webinars to come. I hope you'll take the opportunity to check out the schedule, which I've just shared with you through the chat box, and join us for more offerings. I also shared with you earlier the website to the project, the nationalbookcollection.org website. The link is there in the chat box. I was just taking a look at the site while Fenella was giving her presentation, and there's a tremendous amount of really interesting information, lots of details about the methodology and their processes. So I invite you to check that out as well. I was curious to know, Fenella, what are the next steps here? Where are you at in this process, and what is the plan for the future?
Thank you, Diane. So we were going along quite nicely until we got banned from building. We are doing it, what we're still working hard. It's allowed us to really dig deep into the data, and we're hoping what would be really useful is what people would like to see and engage with. We're trying to be really careful to not make predictions that might be relevant to one decade and not to everything. So that's one thing. So essentially next steps is to try and keep this information coming out to you as we find new information. What we would be really interested in is, as we start to develop some of these stat tests and simple tools, if people would be interested in us sending those out, and we could send out reference papers for them to try them to see if they're simple or not as intuitive as we thought, that would be incredibly helpful, because we want to use this data in an effective and useful way. And what we hope also is that maybe as we start to potentially identify maybe there's a certain decade that is more at risk than another, could a follow on then be, can we delve into that and help with that information? But I think there's a question there.
Yes, definitely. That's interesting. I see we actually have a couple of questions coming in. Thank you for responding to my question. And let me move on to another question, which comes from Rebecca, who asks, what inspired this project? Were there concerns about the preservation of books in the library, and what criteria did they use to select the books included in this project?
Great question. Thank you, Rebecca. So I cut a little short because I knew I only had half an hour. And essentially, this started in about 2015, and there were two groups involved. And it was really where people were starting to get pushed for resources. How do they know how many volumes are out there? Can they trust the catalogue information? How many should they retain or withdraw because they're pretty sure that someone else has it? Then people were saying they were looking on catalogues, shared catalogues. They were finding, oh, so-and-so has got 6 of these. And then when they got rid of theirs, then they would go to borrow it and there'd be 10 pages missing. So there suddenly was a big concern about how to make those decisions. Following on, I know Cliff has been involved and others in some of those interesting projects about the print repositories. And we sort of separated into two groups. One, Ian Bogus and others who's now at Recap, looking at what were the policies and procedures out there, but it kept coming back to, we really need to have a good objective assessment of how do we assess the collection. So from that, we did some pilots in-house with interns looking at different test methods, and then in-house staff, we looked at how could we miniaturize tests to take a minimal sample, but still get those objective analyses. How do we select the 500? We looked at what was common between the 5 partners. We started off with about 3,500 books. We initially looked at a completely random. That concerned me because we weren't getting a good representation of each decade. So we had to do a stratified random sample. So we could look at the number of volumes published per decade and then correlate the number of samples from that decade with what we were pulling, so we could get a statistical representative sample.
Very interesting. That was great. Okay, thank you, Rebecca, and thanks, Fenella, for that response. And we now have a question from Cliff Lynch, so I'm going to hand it over to Cliff.
Okay, thanks. This is not a well-formulated question, but I was really fascinated that with a rather small sample in terms of number of volumes, you managed to show illustrations of all kinds of interesting stuff happening. For example, this phenomenon of it turning out to be an entirely different volume among different partners, or some of these practices about multiple types of paper in a given volume. Do you have a sense for how late in publishing history those kinds of problems are likely to show up? I mean, I think most of the examples that you had looked to me like they were fairly early, but I don't really know that.
No, thank you, Cliff. A great question. So right now, because we're still only just barely at the beginning of the first year, we took the same, we just arbitrarily started at the beginning, so the 1840. So we've only done the 1840 to 1890. It'll be really interesting to see how much we see those multiple paper types going forward and if there's more standardization. We're also curious whether, in fact, are we going to see things from a certain publisher, from a certain decade, and whether those trends are specific for that decade? And that's something that we still, as we, the interesting thing was, because we've got this active collection of data, we can keep building on our knowledge as we bring in new decades and expand that. So we're still only sort of at that early period, because of course there was that publishing increased exponentially as we went through the decades. But yeah, I have to say these have been really fascinating and interesting rabbit holes that we weren't expecting, and I just keep wanting to read more about the history and know more about the history of publishing and publishers, and it's been truly fascinating.
Oh yeah, it sounds like you've uncovered some really interesting mysteries that will be fun to dig into later. Thanks for that question, Cliff, and thank you, Fenella, for that interesting response. And seeing that we are past the end of our time here, I just want to let everyone know that I will be going ahead and shutting down the public portion of this session. So I'll be stopping the recording, but invite you all to stick around after we turn off the recording. Fenella will still be here. We'll leave the webinar environment going, and you can raise your hand if you would like to approach the podium and have a brief exchange with Fenella, make a comment, ask a question. We welcome your interest in doing so. So thank you again to Fenella for this wonderful talk. Thank you again to all of our attendees.
Many thanks for that, Fenella, and I really hope you'll keep us posted as you get back and build out the database.